Harold Frederick Shipman was born on January 14, 1946, in the market town of Nottingham, England. He came into the world just months after the end of World War II, during a period when Britain was rebuilding itself from the ruins of conflict. Shipman's early years appeared unremarkable, the kind of ordinary English upbringing that gave no clue of the darkness that would later consume his life. He was the second of 4 children born to Harold Frederick Shipman Secker, a truck driver, and Vera Shipman, a homemaker who devoted herself to raising her family with a strict hand and a traditional sense of discipline. From the beginning, Harold was known to be bright, reserved, and unusually self-assured. His teachers described him as intelligent and capable, though sometimes distant. He excelled academically, and while many of his classmates struggled with lessons, Harold seemed to grasp subjects quickly, especially science. This early academic promise began to set him apart from others, giving him both confidence and, at times, a quiet arrogance. The Shipman household was working class but deeply respectable. Vera, Harold's mother, was particularly influential in shaping his character. She was strict, proud, and determined that her son would rise above his humble beginnings. Unlike many children of the era, Harold was not encouraged to spend much time with friends. Instead, he was pushed toward study and self-discipline. Vera admired Harold's intelligence and often singled him out as special, a boy destined for more than the average life of labor that awaited many in Nottingham. But beneath the surface of this nurturing, something far darker was brewing. In his teenage years, Harold faced an event that would leave an indelible mark on him. When he was just 17 years old, his mother Vera was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. In those final months, Harold watched closely as his mother's health declined, and he became her primary support. It was during this time that he witnessed, perhaps for the first time, the power doctors held over life and death. The local physician who cared for Vera administered morphine injections to ease her pain, a common medical practice at the time. Harold observed how the drug would bring moments of calm to his mother, but he also witnessed how the doctor's visits marked the pace of her decline. Each injection seemed to Harold to carry a quiet finality, a reminder that death could be controlled, managed, and even hastened by the hands of a trusted doctor. When Vera passed away in June 1963, Harold was devastated, yet the experience left him with a deep fascination and almost clinical interest in the way doctors could influence the end of life. Friends and teachers noted the change in him after his mother's death. He became more withdrawn, more serious, and more determined than ever to succeed. Where others might have collapsed under grief, Harold transformed his sorrow into ambition. He decided to pursue medicine, convinced that becoming a doctor was not only his calling but his destiny. For him, it was a way to honor his mother, to channel his intelligence, and to hold the kind of authority he had seen exercised in his own home during Vera's illness. In 1965, Shipman entered Leeds School of Medicine, one of the leading institutions in northern England. For a boy from a working-class Nottingham family, this was no small achievement. He was the first in his family to attend university, and it confirmed the idea, both in his mind and in his family's, that Harold was indeed exceptional. Medical school life, however, revealed new sides to his character. While his peers were often sociable, energetic, and eager to enjoy their newfound independence, Harold remained serious, sometimes aloof, and frequently isolated. He was described as diligent, but he struggled to connect with others on a personal level. He kept a small circle of acquaintances, but was not widely liked or trusted. This growing sense of detachment, paired with an underlying arrogance about his intelligence, became defining traits. It was also during his time at Leeds that Harold's darker impulses began to surface. He married a young woman named Primrose Oxtoby in 1966, while still in his early 20s. Their relationship seemed conventional at first. Primrose was devoted and supportive, and together they would go on to have 4 children. But behind the scenes, Harold began experimenting with drugs. By the early 1970s, he had developed a secret addiction to pethidine, a powerful opioid painkiller. His ability to secure and administer such substances was facilitated by his growing medical knowledge and access, foreshadowing the methods he would later use to kill. The addiction spiraled quickly, and soon colleagues noticed troubling patterns. Shipman would forge prescriptions, deceive pharmacists, and manipulate patients to feed his habit. His first downfall came in 1975 when he was caught writing fraudulent prescriptions. He was investigated and briefly entered a treatment program, but this was seen more as a lapse in judgment than the exposure of a dangerous character. After completing rehabilitation, Harold was able to continue practicing medicine, and the incident was quietly brushed aside. These early warning signs, his arrogance, his fascination with morphine, his detachment from others, and his willingness to cross ethical boundaries, were all in place before he ever began killing his patients. Yet no one could have imagined that the quiet boy from Nottingham, who once held his dying mother's hand, would grow into Britain's most prolific serial killer. By the late 1970s, Harold Shipman had established himself as a respected general practitioner, moving into communities where patients trusted him implicitly. To the outside world, he was a devoted family man and a competent doctor. But beneath this respectable image, the seeds of his murderous career had already been planted. Chapter 1 closes with Harold Shipman on the brink of his full medical career, a man shaped by tragedy, armed with knowledge, and already carrying within him the deadly impulses that would soon make him one of the most feared names in British history. In the early 1970s, Harold Shipman entered the medical profession with all the appearances of a promising young doctor. After graduating from Leeds School of Medicine in 1970, he began his first post as a junior house officer at Pontefract General Infirmary. By this time, he was married to Primrose, and together they were starting a family that would eventually grow to include 4 children. To neighbors and colleagues, Shipman seemed like a dedicated professional who was carving out a respectable life. But beneath this image of stability, something more troubling was unfolding. Shipman had long carried with him the memory of his mother's death and the morphine injections that accompanied her final days. Now, as a doctor, he had direct access to powerful drugs. This combination proved catastrophic. It was during his early years in medicine that Shipman developed an addiction to pethidine, a synthetic opioid similar to morphine. At first, the use was hidden, cloaked in the chaos of hospital life. He justified it to himself as a way of managing stress and coping with the pressure of long hours and high expectations. But soon, his dependence deepened. Shipman began forging prescriptions, writing false entries, and manipulating the system to obtain ever-increasing quantities of the drug. For a man who prided himself on control, this was a secret that quickly spiraled out of hand. By 1974, Harold Shipman was working as a general practitioner in Todmorden, a small town in West Yorkshire. It was here that his addiction began to draw attention. Staff members noticed unusual patterns in his prescribing habits. Pharmacists grew suspicious of the number of prescriptions Shipman was writing, often in his own name or under false identities. Eventually, his deception came to light, and in 1975, Shipman was confronted with the consequences of his actions. The investigation revealed that he had been forging prescriptions for pethidine to feed his addiction. He was fined, briefly entered a treatment program, and received counseling for his drug use. It was a moment of humiliation, a stain on his career that might have ended the trajectory of a less determined man. But Shipman was not deterred. He completed the rehabilitation process and, remarkably, managed to rebuild his reputation. In the mid-1970s, the medical system was far less strict about record keeping and oversight than it is today. Instead of being permanently struck off the register, Shipman was allowed to continue practicing medicine. Colleagues, though aware of his past, were willing to give him another chance. For Shipman, this was a turning point. He learned that even serious misconduct could be survived if handled carefully. More importantly, he learned how to better conceal his weaknesses and maintain the appearance of professionalism. By the late 1970s, Shipman had moved to Hyde, a working-class town near Manchester. It was here that he began to establish the persona that would eventually shield his crimes for decades. Hyde was a community that valued trust, familiarity, and the steady presence of local doctors. Patients expected their physicians to know them personally, to visit them at home, and to guide them through illness and old age. Shipman fit this mold perfectly. He was serious, reliable, and available. To many, he seemed like the ideal family doctor. His patients admired him for his thoroughness and dedication. He made house calls without hesitation, especially to elderly patients who could not easily travel. Families trusted him implicitly, often describing him as kind, attentive, and professional. In reality, these very qualities, his willingness to visit patients at home, his calm demeanor, his authority as a physician, created the perfect cover for what he would later become. Shipman's past, however, was not entirely forgotten. Among colleagues, whispers lingered about his addiction. Some viewed him with quiet suspicion, while others dismissed it as a youthful mistake that had been corrected. But Harold himself seemed determined to prove that he had changed. He worked long hours, rarely took vacations, and built a reputation as a doctor who could always be counted on. By the early 1980s, he was firmly embedded in the community of Hyde. Patients registered with him in growing numbers, and his practice flourished. For Shipman, this was more than just professional success. It was a source of power. He enjoyed the respect he commanded, the deference people gave him, and the quiet authority he carried in every interaction. He was not just a doctor, he was a trusted figure in people's most vulnerable moments. Yet, behind this respectability, the seeds of something sinister were already germinating. His fascination with morphine and his early addiction to opioids had not disappeared. Rather, it had been refined into knowledge and control. Shipman understood the effects of painkillers intimately, their ability to ease suffering, but also their capacity to end life quietly, without fuss. He had experienced both the personal tragedy of watching his mother's morphine-assisted decline and the professional scandal of his own drug abuse. Now, with greater access to patients and complete trust from the community, he stood at a crossroads. It was in this period that the outlines of his future crimes began to take shape. While there is no firm evidence that Shipman was killing patients in the late 1970s or early 1980s, many investigators later suspected that his murderous activities may have started earlier than officially recorded. The pattern was simple but chilling. An elderly patient would receive a home visit. Shipman would administer an injection under the guise of medical care, and the patient would die peacefully. Families accepted these deaths as natural. Few questioned the trusted doctor who signed the death certificates. In fact, Shipman's willingness to handle all aspects of the process, caring for the patient, pronouncing the death, and managing the paperwork, meant that suspicions rarely surfaced. Each natural death reinforced his reputation as a caring physician devoted to the elderly. Families saw him as a source of comfort, not realizing that he was quietly experimenting with life and death under the protection of his role. As the 1980s progressed, Shipman's confidence grew. He no longer resembled the young doctor who had stumbled into addiction and disgrace. Instead, he presented himself as an experienced, respected, and reliable figure in Hyde. But beneath this carefully constructed image, the lessons of his past, his mother's morphine injections, his own drug use, his brush with exposure, were fusing into something far darker. By the mid-1980s, Harold Shipman was more than just a doctor. He was a man who had tested the boundaries of trust, secrecy, and control, and discovered that he could get away with it. The stage was now set for him to embark on the killing spree that would make him the most prolific serial murderer in British history. Chapter 2 ends with Shipman firmly established in Hyde, admired by his patients, tolerated by his colleagues, and increasingly comfortable with the idea that as a doctor, he alone could decide who lived and who died. By the early 1980s, Harold Shipman had fully embedded himself into the quiet community of Hyde, near Manchester. He had weathered the scandal of his drug addiction years earlier, rebuilt his reputation, and emerged as a respected family doctor. To the townspeople, he was reliable, compassionate, and professional. The kind of physician who went the extra mile for his patients. Families praised his bedside manner, and elderly residents in particular found comfort in his steady presence. To them, he was more than a doctor. He was a trusted friend in times of vulnerability. But beneath this carefully cultivated image, Shipman was beginning to exercise a far more sinister power. This was the period when investigators believe his killing career truly began. While the exact date of his first murder remains uncertain, evidence suggests that by the early 1980s, Shipman had already begun quietly ending lives under the cover of medical care. His method was chillingly simple. Shipman would administer a lethal dose of diamorphine, medical-grade heroin commonly used for pain relief in terminal cases. The drug, delivered intravenously, could end life quickly and without visible struggle. Patients would simply slip into unconsciousness, their breathing slowing until it ceased. To families, the death appeared peaceful, almost natural. And because Shipman was the attending physician, he could provide an immediate explanation: heart failure, stroke, or natural causes related to age. Few questioned his judgment. What made this method so effective was Shipman's complete control over the process. He selected victims who were elderly, often women, and frequently living alone. These patients trusted him implicitly, sometimes more than their own families. They welcomed him into their homes, unaware that the man in the white coat carried not healing but death. After administering the injection, Shipman would remain calm and reassuring, offering condolences to relatives and swiftly handling the necessary paperwork. With a doctor's signature, death certificates were rarely scrutinized. It was a deadly system that worked flawlessly in the shadows. Shipman's reputation as a caring physician actually reinforced his cover. Families would often remark on how attentive he had been, how he had been there at the very end, providing comfort in their loved one's final moments. His presence at the scene of death was not suspicious. It was expected. Over time, Shipman refined his techniques. He learned how to stagger his murders, ensuring that no obvious pattern would emerge. He targeted patients who were elderly, but not necessarily close to death, meaning their passing seemed sudden, but not impossible. He avoided the very young or otherwise healthy, middle-aged adults, knowing such deaths might provoke questions. He also became skilled at manipulating medical records, altering notes to suggest that patients were in poorer health than they truly were. In this way, the deaths appeared not only natural but medically justified. By the mid-1980s, the number of deaths under Shipman's care was climbing steadily. Yet his status in the community remained untarnished. He continued to be seen as a model GP, diligent, serious, and dedicated. Families recommended him to others, and new patients registered with his practice. Each death, rather than casting suspicion, seemed to strengthen the perception that he was a compassionate doctor who guided his patients gently through the end of life. There were, however, occasional whispers. Some nurses noticed that Shipman's patients seemed to die more frequently than those of other doctors in the area. A few families quietly questioned why their relatives had passed away so suddenly. But these concerns rarely went beyond private conversations. In a small town like Hyde, the authority of a doctor was immense. Challenging a physician, especially one with Shipman's reputation, felt unthinkable. Moreover, Shipman's demeanor did not invite confrontation. He was confident, sometimes to the point of arrogance, and he dismissed concerns with professional certainty. When families asked questions, he provided clear medical explanations, delivered in the calm, authoritative tone that left little room for doubt. Most accepted his word without hesitation. Throughout the late 1980s, his confidence only grew. He was not killing impulsively, he was killing methodically. Each death reinforced his belief that he could act with impunity. No police inquiries were made, no official reviews conducted. Deaths of elderly patients were commonplace, and with Shipman controlling the narrative, they passed through the system unnoticed. It was during this period that Shipman also began developing patterns of behavior that later investigators would identify as signatures. He often chose women in their later years, sometimes widows, who were less likely to have strong family oversight. He preferred patients who lived alone or whose relatives were not present at the time of the visit. These factors minimized the risk of interruption and ensured that he could carry out his injections without witnesses. Another pattern was his tendency to visit patients at home shortly before their deaths. He would arrive unannounced, sometimes under the pretext of checking on their health, and within hours the patient would be dead. To outsiders, it looked like coincidence. To Shipman, it was calculated control over life and death. As the years passed, the toll of his murders mounted. Later investigations would estimate that by the early 1990s, Shipman may already have killed dozens of patients. Yet in Hyde, his reputation remained intact. He was admired, respected, and trusted. No one saw him as a predator. No one suspected the truth. In 1992, Shipman left the group practice where he had been working and set up his own surgery at 21 and Market Street in Hyde. This move gave him even greater autonomy. Now, he was not just one doctor among many. He was the sole authority in his own practice. He hired his own staff, maintained his own records, and ran the operation as he saw fit. For Shipman, this independence was liberating. It meant fewer eyes on his work, fewer colleagues to answer to, and greater control over his patients. The 1990s marked the peak of his killing spree. With his own practice established, Shipman had hundreds of patients under his care. The deaths continued at an alarming rate, but still no one intervened. Families mourned, neighbors whispered, but the doctor's word remained unchallenged. In a community where trust in medical professionals ran deep, Harold Shipman was untouchable. By the early 1990s, the image was set: Harold Shipman, the devoted doctor, serving the people of Hyde with care and compassion. But behind this mask, he was orchestrating one of the most prolific killing campaigns in modern history. His victims numbered in the dozens, perhaps already in the hundreds. Yet he walked freely among the grieving families who saw him as a source of comfort rather than the cause of their pain. Chapter 3 ends with Shipman at the height of his deception. He was admired, trusted, and secure in the belief that he could never be caught. In reality, however, the trail of bodies he left behind was growing too long to remain hidden forever. By the early 1990s, Harold Shipman had become a fixture in Hyde. His surgery at 21's and Market Street was a modest building in the center of town, yet inside, it carried the weight of absolute authority. Patients came and went daily, trusting their health, and in many cases their lives, to the quiet, bespectacled doctor who seemed endlessly serious and devoted. To the townspeople, he was a man who worked tirelessly for their community. To his victims, he was death disguised as care. It was during this decade that Shipman's killing spree accelerated dramatically. Investigators later determined that the majority of his murders took place during the 1990s, with some years recording dozens of suspicious deaths attributed to his care. The method remained the same: lethal doses of diamorphine administered during home visits or appointments. But as his confidence grew, so too did his recklessness. One of Shipman's most chilling tactics was his control over medical records. After administering a fatal injection, he would often return to his surgery and alter the patient's notes. He added fictitious symptoms, exaggerated existing conditions, or inserted false diagnoses that made the sudden death appear medically plausible. In some cases, he even backdated entries to create a timeline of decline that did not exist in reality. This manipulation ensured that when the death certificate was completed, everything appeared consistent. Because Shipman had his own practice, there was little oversight of these records. His staff trusted him, and other doctors rarely questioned his paperwork. The system itself seemed built to shield him. Deaths of elderly patients were so common in Hyde that the steady rise under Shipman's care did not raise immediate alarms. It was only in hindsight, once the scale of his crimes was exposed, that the numbers became shocking. In public, Shipman's reputation continued to flourish. Patients described him as serious and professional, if not particularly warm. He was not the kind of doctor who cracked jokes or indulged in small talk, but his no-nonsense manner was often interpreted as dedication. People believed he cared deeply, even if he expressed it in a stern, clinical way. For elderly patients, especially widows and those living alone, this seriousness felt reassuring. They trusted that he was looking out for their best interests. Shipman himself thrived on this trust. Each time a family accepted his explanation for a death, each time he signed a certificate without challenge, he grew bolder. The sense of power he felt, the ability to decide who lived and who died without consequence, was intoxicating. He believed himself untouchable, hidden in plain sight under the cloak of respectability. But even in Hyde, whispers began to grow. By the mid-1990s, local undertakers noticed something unusual. Certain families seemed to lose loved ones far more frequently than others, and more strikingly, a significant number of those deaths involved patients of Dr. Shipman. Undertakers are, by nature of their profession, attuned to patterns of mortality. While one or two sudden deaths might be dismissed as coincidence, the repeated association with a single doctor began to stand out. Nurses, too, observed oddities. Some found it peculiar that Shipman was so often present when patients died. Others remarked that his patients appeared to pass away at home in unusually high numbers compared to other practices. These suspicions, however, were rarely voiced aloud. The authority of a doctor in small-town England was immense. For many, even the thought of accusing a physician of wrongdoing felt absurd. Shipman himself seemed aware of these whispers, but rather than retreating, he leaned into his arrogance. He continued to kill at an extraordinary rate, confident that no one would dare question him seriously. In fact, he seemed to relish the control he held over not only his victims, but their families and the broader community. The deaths he caused were not random acts of violence. They were calculated exercises of power carried out under the guise of professional duty. One telling feature of this period was his increasing involvement in the documentation of death. Shipman often encouraged families to have their loved ones cremated rather than buried, a choice that conveniently destroyed any physical evidence of lethal injections. He also insisted on handling the paperwork himself, ensuring that his version of events was the official record. When families hesitated, his authoritative demeanor left little room for debate. Most complied without question. Despite the growing body count, official suspicions did not immediately crystallize. The deaths were scattered, each appearing natural in isolation. Families grieved quietly, unaware that their loss was part of a larger pattern. Only those who worked regularly with death, undertakers, nurses, and eventually statisticians, began to see that something was deeply wrong. Yet even these concerns failed to stop him. In 1998, Shipman reached a new level of audacity when he targeted a woman named Kathleen Grundy, a wealthy and respected member of the community. Unlike many of his earlier victims, Grundy was not frail or terminally ill. She was active, healthy, and well known in Hyde society. Her sudden death raised more questions than usual. But what truly exposed Shipman's arrogance was what came after. He attempted to forge her will, leaving himself as the main beneficiary of her estate. This act was a turning point. While Shipman had previously operated under the cover of medical authority, the forgery of a legal document was sloppy, greedy, and overtly criminal. It gave investigators something tangible to pursue, evidence that could not be brushed aside as medical judgment. But that exposure lay just ahead. In the years leading up to his downfall, Shipman's confidence bordered on recklessness. He had killed for nearly 2 decades without detection, and in his mind, he was invincible. The whispers of suspicion from undertakers and colleagues did not slow him. The trust of the community remained intact, and his ability to manipulate records and paperwork continued to shield him from scrutiny. Chapter 4 closes with Harold Shipman at the height of his arrogance. His killings were escalating, his confidence unshaken, and his crimes bolder than ever. Yet the cracks were beginning to show. The undertakers had noticed, nurses had whispered, and soon the authorities would be forced to look closer at the doctor who seemed always to be there when death arrived. On the morning of June 24, 1998, the town of Hyde was shocked to learn of the sudden death of Kathleen Grundy. She was 81 years old, but unlike many of Shipman's other victims, Kathleen was vibrant, healthy, and well known in the community. A former mayor of Hyde, she was active in local charities, regularly attended social events, and showed no signs of slowing down. To her family and friends, she seemed full of life. When Dr. Harold Shipman arrived at her home that morning, he found her alone. Within a short time, Kathleen was dead. As he had done countless times before, Shipman calmly explained that her passing was due to natural causes. He signed the death certificate himself, stating that she had died of old age. To most, this explanation seemed reasonable. After all, death comes suddenly for the elderly, and with a trusted doctor's word, there was little cause for alarm. But Kathleen's daughter, Angela Woodruff, was not convinced. A successful solicitor, Angela was used to reading documents carefully and spotting inconsistencies. When she learned of her mother's death, she was saddened but not immediately suspicious. What raised alarm came later when she discovered that her mother's will had been altered. The will in question left nearly all of Kathleen Grundy's estate, worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, to her doctor, Harold Shipman. Angela was stunned. Not only had her mother never mentioned such an arrangement, but the document itself looked crude and suspicious. The language was unlike her mother's usual style. The signatures appeared forced, and the content seemed completely out of character. Angela knew her mother's values. She had always been dedicated to her family and her community. The idea that she would disinherit her children to benefit a doctor she had only known professionally was absurd. Angela immediately contacted the authorities. She explained that she believed the will was forged and that Shipman had something to do with her mother's death. At first, the claim seemed shocking. Accusing a doctor, especially one with Shipman's reputation, of murder was no small step. Yet Angela's credibility as a solicitor, combined with the suspicious circumstances of the will, compelled the police to take her concerns seriously. What Angela did not know at the time was that her suspicions aligned with concerns already brewing in Hyde. Local undertakers and other medical professionals had quietly noticed that Shipman's patients died at unusually high rates, and many of those deaths occurred at home with Shipman present. These murmurs, combined with Angela's formal complaint, finally pushed the authorities to act. Kathleen Grundy's body was exhumed in August 1998. Forensic pathologists conducted a detailed examination, and the results were damning. High levels of diamorphine were found in her system, inconsistent with any legitimate medical treatment she should have received. There was no medical justification for such a dose. The conclusion was clear: Kathleen Grundy had been deliberately poisoned. This revelation marked the beginning of the end for Harold Shipman. The forged will provided the motive, and the toxicology results provided the means. For the first time, investigators had hard evidence linking the trusted doctor to a patient's suspicious death. When police searched Shipman's home and practice, they uncovered a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. His medical records revealed patterns of altered notes, with entries added after patients' deaths to create the illusion of declining health. His computer contained unusual activity, including falsified records written after patients had already died. Investigators also found jewelry belonging to deceased patients, items Shipman had kept as macabre trophies of his crimes. The scale of the evidence was overwhelming. As police delved deeper, they realized Kathleen Grundy's death was not an isolated incident. They began reviewing the deaths of Shipman's other patients, and the numbers quickly grew staggering. Patterns emerged: elderly women, sudden deaths at home, Shipman present at the time, and diamorphine as the likely cause. The quiet, trusted doctor of Hyde was now being recast as Britain's most prolific serial killer. Yet even as the investigation intensified, Shipman maintained an air of arrogance. When questioned about Kathleen Grundy's will, he denied forging it and insisted that she had wanted to leave her estate to him. He spoke with the same calm, authoritative tone that had convinced families for decades. But this time, his explanations fell flat. The evidence was too strong, the circumstances too damning. The arrest of Harold Shipman in September 1998 sent shockwaves through Hyde and the wider medical community. How could a doctor, a man sworn to save lives, be accused of deliberately killing his patients? For the families of his victims, The news was devastating. Many who had long accepted their loved ones' deaths as natural were now forced to confront the possibility that those deaths had been murders. The case of Kathleen Grundy became the cornerstone of the prosecution. It was the crack in the facade, the undeniable proof that Shipman's carefully constructed image of professionalism was a mask hiding monstrous deeds. Without Angela Woodruff's persistence, it is possible that Shipman might have continued killing undetected for years to come. Her refusal to accept the suspicious will set in motion the chain of events that ultimately exposed his crimes. As the police investigation widened, more and more families came forward, each with stories of loved ones who had died suddenly under Shipman's care. Each story, once dismissed as coincidence, now took on a new and chilling significance. Chapter 5 closes with the image of Harold Shipman under arrest, his calm demeanor finally pierced by the weight of evidence. For 2 decades he had operated with impunity, hidden by trust and authority. But with Kathleen Grundy's death, his empire of deception began to crumble. The doctor who once walked freely among grieving families was now facing the full force of the law. In September 1998, when Harold Shipman was arrested for the suspected murder of Kathleen Grundy, the people of Hyde were stunned. The quiet, bespectacled doctor who had served their community for decades, the man who had delivered babies, comforted the sick, and signed countless death certificates, was suddenly being called a murderer. Many refused to believe it. Others, who had quietly harbored doubts for years, felt a grim sense of confirmation. But no one was prepared for the scale of what the police were about to uncover. The investigation began with Kathleen Grundy's forged will and the forensic evidence that proved she had been poisoned with diamorphine. That alone was enough to charge Shipman with murder and fraud. But detectives suspected there was more, much more. The unusual patterns in his patients' deaths, the whispers from undertakers, and the quiet concerns from other medical professionals suggested that Grundy's case was just the tip of the iceberg. The Greater Manchester Police launched a full-scale inquiry. At the center of the investigation was Detective Superintendent Bernard Possells, who immediately recognized the enormity of the task. Shipman had been practicing medicine for nearly 3 decades, with thousands of patients under his care. Sorting through his records, identifying suspicious deaths, and gathering evidence would require an extraordinary effort. One of the first steps was to examine Shipman's medical records. Investigators quickly noticed troubling patterns. In case after case, patient notes had been altered shortly before or after the time of death. Symptoms of heart disease, respiratory problems, or frailty were often inserted into the files, entries that conveniently explained why the patient had died suddenly. In some instances, the records had been changed after the patient was already dead, evidence of deliberate falsification. The more they looked, the worse it became. Death rates among Shipman's patients were far higher than those of other doctors in the region. Statistical analysis revealed that elderly women under his care were dying at an unusually high frequency, often in circumstances that defied normal expectations. The data painted a chilling picture. Shipman's patients were dying at rates that simply could not be explained by chance. Forensic evidence further reinforced the case. In addition to Kathleen Grundy, the bodies of several other former patients were exhumed. Toxicology tests revealed lethal levels of diamorphine in their systems, administered in doses far beyond any therapeutic need. Shipman had always claimed he did not prescribe diamorphine for pain relief, yet the chemical traces in his patients told a different story. Police also discovered a disturbing cache of jewelry in Shipman's home. Rings, bracelets, and other items belonging to deceased patients were found hidden away. To investigators, these objects seemed like trophies, mementos kept by a killer who wanted to preserve a connection to his victims. The presence of the jewelry destroyed any lingering illusions about his innocence. As the scope of the investigation expanded, the media descended on Hyde. The story of Dr. Death made headlines across Britain and beyond. The press grappled with the shocking contradiction. How could a trusted family doctor, a man bound by the Hippocratic oath to do no harm, have killed so many of his patients? The public struggled with the same question. In living rooms and pubs across the country, people debated whether such evil could hide behind such an ordinary exterior. Families of Shipman's patients were devastated. Many had long accepted the deaths of their loved ones as natural, never questioning the explanations Shipman provided. Now they faced the horrifying possibility that those deaths had been murders. Grief was compounded by betrayal. The man they had trusted to care for their mothers, fathers, and grandparents might have been the very one who ended their lives. The inquiry revealed that Shipman's murders stretched back decades. Detectives pieced together a timeline suggesting he had begun killing in the early 1980s, perhaps even earlier. By the mid-1990s, his killings had accelerated, sometimes with multiple deaths occurring in a single week. The estimated number of victims quickly grew into the dozens, then the hundreds. The sheer scale was unprecedented. While serial killers in Britain had claimed multiple victims before, none came close to Shipman's tally. Experts began to label him the most prolific serial killer in modern history. For every victim identified, there were likely others whose deaths had gone undetected, their bodies cremated before toxicology could ever be performed. Despite the mounting evidence, Shipman himself remained defiant. During police interviews, he denied everything. He claimed Kathleen Grundy had willingly left him her estate, insisted that the jewelry belonged to his wife, and rejected the idea that he had ever deliberately harmed a patient. His tone was calm, even arrogant, as if he still believed he could talk his way out of suspicion. But this time, his authority carried no weight. The evidence was too overwhelming, the lies too transparent. The investigation soon moved toward prosecution. Shipman was charged with 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery relating to the Grundy will. The decision to limit the charges to 15 was strategic. Prosecutors wanted to present the strongest, most clear-cut cases rather than overwhelm the jury with hundreds of allegations. Still, the 15 charges represented only a fraction of his suspected victims. For Hyde, the unfolding case was shattering. Families who had long praised Shipman now questioned every interaction they had ever had with him. Former patients wondered why they had survived while others had not. The town that once held him in such high regard became synonymous with betrayal and death. Nationally, the case forced a reckoning. Questions arose about how the medical system had allowed Shipman to operate unchecked for so long. Why had no one investigated the unusually high death rates? Why had his earlier drug addiction not raised more alarms? And how could one man, shielded by trust and authority, carry out such a vast campaign of murder without detection? Chapter 6 ends with Harold Shipman facing trial. The investigation had stripped away the mask of respectability and revealed the monster beneath. The evidence was overwhelming, the families outraged, and the nation horrified. For years he had walked freely among the people of Hyde, hiding in plain sight. But now the world knew his name, not as a trusted doctor, but as the most prolific serial killer Britain had ever seen. On October 5, 1999, the trial of Dr. Harold Shipman began at Preston Crown Court. The eyes of Britain and much of the world were fixed on the case. For over a year, the investigation had revealed a horrifying pattern of murder and betrayal. But now it was time for a jury to decide whether the evidence proved beyond doubt that Shipman was guilty. Shipman faced charges of 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery, the latter relating to the forged will of Kathleen Grundy. Prosecutors had deliberately limited the charges to 15 victims, not because there was a lack of evidence in other cases, but because they wanted the trial to remain clear, manageable, and focused. Each of these 15 cases had strong forensic support, altered medical records, or eyewitness testimony. Collectively, they painted a picture of a doctor who had systematically used his position to kill. The prosecution was led by Richard Henricks, QC, a formidable barrister known for his clarity and precision. From the outset, Henricks laid out a devastating narrative. Shipman, under the guise of medical care, had injected his elderly patients with lethal doses of diamorphine, falsified their medical records, and then certified their deaths as natural. He emphasized the calculated, methodical nature of the crimes. This was not mercy killing, nor was it reckless prescribing. It was cold-blooded murder. The jury heard the harrowing stories of 15 victims, many of them elderly women, who had died suddenly while under Shipman's care. In each case, the pattern was disturbingly consistent. A visit from the doctor, a sudden and unexplained collapse, and then death. Shipman would often remain calm as the life drained from his patient, later reassuring grieving families that their loved ones had passed peacefully and naturally. One of the most damning cases was that of Kathleen Grundy. The forged will was shown to the court, with handwriting experts confirming it was falsified. Prosecutors presented evidence that Shipman had written it himself, attempting to inherit nearly 400,000 from his patient. For the jury, this was a clear demonstration of motive financial gain. The toxicology results, which revealed high levels of diamorphine in her body, provided the method. Together, they created an airtight case of premeditated murder. The prosecution also presented computer evidence from Shipman's practice. Investigators had discovered that he had altered medical records after his patients had died, backdating symptoms to make it appear as though the victims were already unwell. For example, in the case of Marie Quinn, records showed he had entered notes after her death, fabricating a history of chest pains. This pattern repeated across multiple victims, exposing a systematic effort to cover his tracks. Another powerful element of the prosecution's case came from statistical analysis. Expert witnesses testified that the death rates in Shipman's practice were far higher than those of any other local doctors. Among elderly female patients, the rate was shockingly disproportionate. The probability that these deaths were natural was virtually zero. To the jury, the statistics were not just numbers. They were evidence of an impossible pattern, one that could only be explained by deliberate killing. Throughout the trial, families of the victims sat in the courtroom, listening as their loved ones' deaths were retold in painful detail. For them, the process was both heartbreaking and necessary. Many had long accepted Shipman's reassurances that their mothers, grandmothers, or wives had died naturally. Now, they were forced to confront the cruel reality that these deaths were not peaceful passings, but calculated murders. Shipman's defense, led by Nicola Davies, QC, was limited. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that the prosecution had failed to provide direct proof of murder. They suggested that elderly patients naturally die in large numbers, and that Shipman's role as a doctor simply placed him near these events. Regarding the forged will, the defense claimed that Kathleen Grundy had genuinely intended to leave her estate to Shipman? Though handwriting experts and common sense strongly undermined this assertion, perhaps the most telling moment of the trial came from Shipman himself. He refused to admit guilt, maintaining his innocence throughout. He showed little emotion, sitting quietly and often appearing detached as the details of his alleged crimes were recounted. To some observers, his calm demeanor seemed almost chilling, a sign of arrogance, or perhaps of a man so convinced of his authority that he believed he could still talk his way out of suspicion. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses testified about Shipman's presence at the scene of sudden deaths. Experts confirmed the lethal doses of diamorphine. The forged will stood as undeniable proof of deceit and greed. And the altered medical records revealed a man who had meticulously tried to manipulate the narrative of his patients' lives and deaths. After a trial lasting nearly 4 months, the jury retired to deliberate. On January 31, 2000, they returned with their verdict: guilty on all 15 counts of murder and guilty of forgery. The judge, Mr. Justice Forbes, addressed Shipman directly during sentencing. He condemned the doctors, wicked and evil crimes, noting that Shipman had betrayed the trust placed in him by his patients and their families. He sentenced Shipman to life imprisonment, recommending that he never be released. The judge's words reflected not only the gravity of the crimes, but also the sense of betrayal felt across Britain. The verdict sent shockwaves through the country. While many had suspected that Shipman was guilty, hearing the jury confirm it made the horror undeniable. The families of victims wept in court, some expressing relief that justice had been served, others overwhelmed by the grief of knowing their loved ones had been murdered by the very man they had trusted most. Nationally, the case dominated headlines. Dr. Death became a household phrase. Editorials questioned how such a killer had gone undetected for so long. Calls for reform in the medical system grew louder, with demands for tighter controls on doctors, better oversight of prescribing practices, and more rigorous reviews of death certification. For Harold Shipman, the trial marked the end of his life as a free man. No longer the respected doctor of Hyde, he was now Britain's most infamous serial killer, condemned to spend the rest of his days behind bars. But for the families of his victims, the trial was not the end. It was only the beginning of a long process of grief, healing, and unanswered questions. Chapter 7 closes with the image of Shipman being led from the courtroom, expressionless as ever, sentenced to spend the remainder of his life in prison. Justice had been served, but the shadow of his crimes would haunt Britain for years to come. When the gavel fell in January 2000 and Harold Shipman was sentenced to life imprisonment, Britain let out a collective breath. The most prolific serial killer in modern history was finally behind bars. Yet the story did not end there. For the families of his victims, the pain was far from over. And for the nation, the shockwaves of his crimes would ripple through the prison system, the medical community, and the government for years to come. Shipman was sent to H.M. Prison, Manchester, known as Strangeways, before being transferred to H.M. Prison, Frankland, and later to Wakefield Prison, one of the highest security facilities in the country. Wakefield was infamous, housing some of Britain's most dangerous criminals. It was there that Shipman, the once respected family doctor, would spend the remainder of his days. From the beginning, prison staff noted his unusual demeanor. Unlike many prisoners who raged against their sentences or sought sympathy, Shipman remained calm and almost indifferent. He continued to proclaim his innocence, refusing to admit to a single murder. To some guards, this stoicism seemed arrogant. To others, It was simply chilling. He behaved not as a man burdened by guilt, but as someone convinced of his own superiority, even within the confines of prison walls. His medical background gave him a peculiar status among other inmates. Some were curious, even deferential, treating him with a kind of twisted respect. Others despised him, particularly those who saw him as a predator who had targeted the vulnerable. Still, Shipman managed to avoid major conflicts, keeping largely to himself and maintaining the same detached air he had shown during his trial. In prison, Shipman maintained routines that mirrored his life outside. He kept his cell meticulously tidy, read books, and engaged in little conversation. He showed no signs of remorse, no attempts to explain or justify his crimes. When questioned by prison psychologists, he remained evasive, never revealing his motives. This refusal to confess or cooperate left experts frustrated and families of victims tormented. They wanted answers. Why had he done it? What had driven a respected doctor to kill hundreds of patients? But Shipman offered nothing. Silence became his final weapon. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, Britain was in uproar. The case had shaken the very foundations of trust between the public and the medical profession. For centuries, doctors had been viewed as guardians of health, figures of near sacred trust. Shipman shattered that illusion. If a respected family doctor could commit such atrocities undetected, how safe were patients in the care of others? The government faced mounting pressure to respond. In 2000, a public inquiry was launched, chaired by Dame Janet Smith, to investigate how Shipman had been able to kill for so long without being caught. The inquiry would eventually last years and produce multiple volumes of findings, but even in its early stages, it revealed alarming gaps in oversight. One of the biggest issues was the system of death certification. Shipman had exploited his authority to sign off on hundreds of deaths without challenge. Families trusted him, colleagues rarely questioned him, and the process lacked adequate safeguards. The inquiry recommended sweeping reforms, independent checks on death certificates, better monitoring of prescribing practices, and systems to identify unusual patterns in mortality rates. The fallout also extended to the regulation of controlled substances. Shipman's weapon of choice had been diamorphine, a powerful opioid. He had access to it through his medical practice and had used it to kill quietly and efficiently. New rules were introduced to track the prescribing and use of opioids more closely, making it harder for doctors to misuse them. As these reforms were debated and implemented, the public remained fixated on Shipman himself. Newspapers ran stories about his life in prison, speculating on whether he would ever confess. Families of victims wrote open letters, pleading with him to explain why he had targeted their loved ones. But Shipman remained silent. His refusal to provide closure became another form of cruelty, deepening the wounds he had already inflicted. In 2001, Shipman attempted to appeal his conviction. His lawyers argued that the trial had been flawed, that the evidence was circumstantial, and that he had been unfairly portrayed as a monster. But the Court of Appeal swiftly rejected his case. The evidence was overwhelming, the conviction secure. Shipman's fate was sealed. He would die in prison. Over time, even his family began to fracture under the weight of his crimes. His wife, Primrose, who had stood by him during the trial, continued to visit him in prison, at least initially. But as the years passed, the strain grew unbearable. For their children, the stigma of being linked to Britain's most notorious serial killer was devastating. They lived with the shadow of his crimes, burdened by questions they could never answer. For the victims' families, justice brought little comfort. They had seen him convicted, yes, but many still did not know whether their loved ones had been among his victims. Estimates suggested Shipman had killed over 200 people, perhaps as many as 250, but only 15 had been proven in court. For every family left in limbo, the grief was compounded by uncertainty. Some wondered whether their parents had died naturally or at the hands of Dr. Death. By 2003, Shipman was marking nearly 5 years behind bars. His health was reportedly stable, his behavior consistent. But prison officers noticed a growing tension around his financial situation. Shipman had become eligible for a state pension, and if he lived to collect it, much of the money could potentially support his wife. Some officers speculated that this fact weighed on him, as did the knowledge that his family's life had been forever destroyed by his crimes. Chapter 8 closes with Shipman sitting silently in his prison cell at Wakefield, his face unreadable, his mind a mystery. Outside, Britain was still reeling from the betrayal, families were still grieving, and the medical system was undergoing reforms to prevent another tragedy. But the man at the center of it all remained silent, refusing to provide answers, refusing to show remorse, locked away in a cage yet still holding a chilling kind of control over the narrative of his crimes. On the morning of January 13, 2004, the United Kingdom awoke to shocking news. Harold Shipman, the man branded Dr. Death, the trusted physician turned prolific serial killer, was dead. At precisely 6:20 a.m., prison officers at HM Prison Wakefield discovered him hanging in his cell. He had fashioned a noose from his bedsheets and tied it to the bars of his window. By the time guards arrived, he was already gone. Shipman had chosen the day before his 58th birthday to end his life. His death marked the final chapter of his story, but instead of bringing closure, it ignited new debates, fresh anger, and even deeper mysteries. For the families of his victims, the news was bittersweet. Some felt a sense of relief that the man who had taken so much from them was gone forever. Others were furious. His suicide robbed them of the chance to ever understand why he had killed. For years, they had pleaded with him to confess, to explain his motives, to acknowledge the pain he had caused. Instead, he took his secrets to the grave. The official investigation into his death concluded that Shipman had killed himself deliberately and with planning. Inmates and guards reported that he had shown no outward signs of distress in the days leading up to his suicide. He had eaten normally, followed his routine, and spoken calmly. But privately, prison staff had noted 2 factors that might have influenced his decision. First was his family's financial situation. Under pension rules at the time, if Shipman died before turning 60, his wife Primrose would be entitled to a full pension. If he lived past that age, much of the money would be lost. Many speculated that his suicide was an act of control, a final way of ensuring financial security for his wife, even as he left her with the stigma of his crimes. The second factor was control itself. Shipman had always thrived on dominance. In life, he controlled his patients' deaths, deciding who lived and who died. In prison, stripped of power, his last act of control may have been to decide the time and manner of his own death. By hanging himself, he denied the system the satisfaction of keeping him alive, and he denied the victims' families the chance of ever hearing a confession. Public reaction to his suicide was swift and divided. Some newspapers declared it justice served, the ultimate punishment for a man who had taken so many lives. Others saw it as a betrayal, a final insult to the families who longed for answers. Politicians weighed in, questioning whether prison staff should have done more to prevent his death. The government launched an inquiry, which ultimately found that while there had been concerns about Shipman's mental state, There was no clear indication he intended to kill himself. For the families, the suicide left a gaping wound. They had hoped that, given time, Shipman might reveal the truth. How many victims there were, why he had killed, and whether their loved ones had been among them. Instead, his silence became permanent. To this day, the exact number of his victims remains uncertain. Official inquiries concluded that he likely murdered at least 215 people, but the true toll may be closer to 250. The lack of a confession means the full scope of his crimes will never be known. In the aftermath of his death, Britain once again wrestled with questions about motive. Why had Harold Shipman done it? Was it financial gain, as in the case of Kathleen Grundy? Was it a lust for power, the thrill of playing God over life and death? Or was it, as some psychiatrists suggested, a compulsive urge he himself might not have fully understood? The absence of answers turned him into a dark enigma, a figure who killed not only bodies but also the truth itself. His family, meanwhile, withdrew further from the public eye. Primrose Shipman, who had stood by him even during his trial, faced renewed scrutiny. Some wondered how much she had known. Others sympathized with the impossible position she found herself in. For Shipman's children, the stigma was unbearable. They had to navigate life knowing their father was remembered as one of the most infamous killers in modern history. Shipman's death also reignited debates about prison procedures. Critics argued that he should have been placed under closer supervision, particularly given his high-profile status. Supporters of stricter policies claimed that his suicide was preventable, while others countered that keeping him alive would have been a hollow victory if he was determined to die. The controversy highlighted the delicate balance between punishment, prevention, and the psychological realities of incarceration. But beyond policy debates, the most profound impact was emotional. In Hyde, where Shipman had lived and worked for decades, the community continued to reel. Streets where he had once walked freely now bore the shadow of his crimes. Families visited graves, wondering whether the deaths had been natural or whether their loved ones had been another tally in Shipman's hidden count. His suicide offered no closure, only finality. Even in death, Shipman left a legacy of pain. His story became a case study for criminologists, psychologists, and historians. He was cited in discussions of medical ethics, systemic failures, and the psychology of serial killers. Unlike many killers, Shipman had no clear profile. He was not chaotic or flamboyant, not driven by obvious rage or sexual desire. He was ordinary, respectable, trusted, and that was what made him so terrifying. As Chapter 9 draws to a close, we picture the barred window of Shipman's prison cell, the noose tied neatly, the silence that followed. For some, his death was an ending. For others, it was the beginning of endless questions. Harold Shipman had killed hundreds in life, but in death, he killed the truth. His silence left a void that no inquiry, no investigation, and no speculation could ever fill. The death of Harold Shipman in January 2004 did not end his story. If anything, it cemented his legacy as one of history's most chilling figures. Even in death, his crimes reverberated through Britain, reshaping the medical profession, reforming laws, and forcing society to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, authority, and the thin line between care and harm. In the months following his suicide, public anger boiled. Families of victims gathered in Hyde, some mourning in silence, others demanding answers that would never come. They had been denied justice twice, first by the murders themselves, and then by Shipman's refusal to confess. His silence meant the true number of his victims would remain a haunting mystery. Estimates ranged between 215 confirmed deaths and as many as 250 possible victims, making him the most prolific serial killer in modern history. The government, determined to learn from the tragedy, pressed ahead with the Shipman Inquiry, chaired by Dame Janet Smith. The inquiry was one of the most exhaustive in British legal history, producing 6 volumes and more than 5,000 pages of findings between 2002 and 2005. It painted a damning portrait not just of Shipman, but of the systems that had failed to stop him. The inquiry revealed that Shipman had been able to exploit weaknesses in death certification. As a doctor, he could sign off on causes of death without independent scrutiny. Time and again, he certified his own murders as natural causes. There was no safeguard, no second opinion, no oversight. His authority as a physician gave him near total control over life, death, and the official record. Another key failure was in the monitoring of controlled drugs. Shipman had easy access to diamorphine, the opioid he used to kill. Despite his earlier conviction for drug misuse in the 1970s, there were no long-term restrictions on his ability to prescribe. The system trusted him blindly, allowing him to order, store, and administer lethal drugs with little accountability. The reforms that followed were sweeping. New laws required that all deaths be independently verified by a medical examiner, not just the attending physician. This change introduced a second layer of scrutiny, making it far harder for a single doctor to conceal suspicious patterns. Prescribing practices for controlled substances were tightened, with stricter rules on tracking, storage, and reporting. Computer systems were updated to flag unusual prescribing behavior, and audits became routine. The medical profession itself underwent cultural change. Trust, once taken for granted, was no longer assumed without question. Patients and families began asking more, challenging more, and expecting more transparency. Doctors, too, became more aware of their accountability, not only to patients, but to regulators and society at large. But perhaps the greatest impact of the Shipman case was psychological. It shattered one of society's deepest assumptions that doctors, by virtue of their profession, could be trusted implicitly. Shipman proved that even those sworn to heal could harbor monstrous intentions. The betrayal cut deep. It was not simply that he killed. It was that he killed under the mask of care, using compassion as camouflage. For criminologists and psychologists, Shipman became a case study in the complexities of evil. Unlike many serial killers, he displayed no outward chaos. He was organized, meticulous, and controlled. He did not kill for obvious financial gain. Kathleen Grundy's forged will was an exception, not the rule. Nor did he fit the profile of sexually motivated killers. His motives remain opaque. Was it a desire for power, a need for control, or a compulsive urge he himself could not articulate? His refusal to confess left the question unanswered, ensuring that his true psychology remains one of the darkest mysteries in criminology. In Hyde, his memory lingers like a scar. The town once trusted him with their health, their families, their lives. Today, the name Harold Shipman is spoken with anger, sadness, and disbelief. Memorials to victims, plaques, and gatherings remind the community of the lives lost and the importance of vigilance. For survivors and families, the grief never truly ends. Each birthday missed, each family event without a loved one is a reminder of what was stolen. Internationally, Shipman's name became synonymous with betrayal by authority. He is often cited alongside figures like Joseph Mengele and other medical criminals who turned healing into harm. But unlike Mengele, Shipman did not operate in war or under tyranny. He worked in the heart of a peaceful community, protected by trust and routine. That ordinariness is what makes his case uniquely terrifying. The reforms inspired by his crimes extended beyond Britain. Other nations studied the Shipman Inquiry, implementing their own safeguards to prevent similar abuses. His case reshaped global conversations about patient safety, medical oversight, and the balance between trust and accountability. Yet, even with reforms, even with lessons learned, the horror of Shipman's crimes lingers. Numbers on a page cannot capture the human cost. Over 200 lives, each a story cut short. Mothers, fathers, grandparents, people who should have lived longer, who should have died naturally, surrounded by family, not poisoned in their homes. Shipman robbed them not only of life, but of dignity in death. For his family, the legacy is unbearable. His wife Primrose and his children have lived under the weight of his crimes, carrying the shame of a name that became a curse. They, too, were victims in their own way, innocent yet forever marked. As we reflect on Harold Shipman's legacy, one thing becomes clear: his crimes changed medicine forever. The doctor who once inspired trust inspired reform instead. His betrayal forced a profession to look inward, to question its systems, and to build safeguards that might prevent another Dr. Death. And yet, for all the inquiries, reforms, and debates, the central question remains unanswered: why? Why did Harold Shipman, a man with a stable career, a family, and the respect of his community, choose to kill? Why did he spend decades ending lives that were not his to take? We may never know. His silence, his arrogance, and his death ensured that the truth died with him. Chapter 10 closes not with Shipman himself, but with the memory of those he killed. They are the true story, the lives behind the numbers, the faces behind the statistics. Harold Shipman's name is infamous, but it is the victims who deserve remembrance. In every reform, in every safeguard, in every patient who now lives with more protection than before, their legacy lives on.